Okay, Warren.
Okay, you want to take attendance?
Yes, we have Giebert, Bachhuber, Potter, and Pellman.
Okay, we need a motion for approval of the minutes from March 16th.
I'll move approval.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor of approval, say aye.
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 Okay, the minutes are approved. Next item of business then is the Stricker-Tiedemann research study.
Yes, we have Grace Wilkinson and Helen Schlim here from UW who would like to tell us, and Jessica Briggs, excuse me, who are going to explain to us what their proposal is.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. And Eric, should I just tell you when to advance?
I think that'll work easiest, but
Wonderful.
no promises.
Okay.
Hey, Eric, can you hear me?
I can, Ken. Can you hear everybody else? Ken?
I can't hear. Eric, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you see me?
I can see Ken and I can hear him too.
Sorry, all.
That's fine.
Ken, are you hearing us? Doesn't look like it.
He has to hit unmute probably.
No, it doesn't show it anyway.
We should be able to hold up a sign.
Yeah.
Maybe ever call him again, Jim.
Hello?
Ken?
We can hear you,
Anybody hear me?
Ken. Yes.
Shit. I can't hear anything.
Yeah,
I just,
we see you, Ken, and we hear you. So I think they got to start the meeting now, and I think they soon will.
I just texted him.
I just sent him an email too.
All right.
Well, Ken is waiting for us. Since we are all quiet, he says he can't hear, but we can see him, we can hear him, right?
Yeah, I split.
Okay.
Warren, we could advance without Ken for this first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you
Yes.
hear us?
Yeah, okay, something, but I can't, I just started hearing you just a minute ago.
All right.
So I don't know what the issue is, but
Well, if you can hear us now, let's
okay,
roll.
I can hear you now, yeah. Can you, as long as you can hear me, I can hear you, okay. And I see the
Perfect.
screen.
All right, Grace, Helen.
All right. Wonderful. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please, Eric. So I'm Dr. Grace Wilkinson. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And joining me this evening is Jess Briggs, who's a PhD student in my group, and Helen Schlimm, who's a research specialist in my group. And we all actually just moved to Wisconsin last year when I started at the university. And so we've been getting to know this wonderful city and thinking about how our research goals might fit in here as well. And so that's what we hope to talk to you about today, is a research study that we have funded by the National Science Foundation that we would like to use Strickers and Tiedemann's ponds as our laboratory to address these questions, but we'll also hopefully have generate some data and knowledge that will be useful for this commission as well. So that's what we want to share with you today, and get your insights and inputs as people that know these systems far better than we do as well. Next slide, please. So just briefly about my group and what we do, we're really interested in the dynamic links between lakes and their surrounding landscape. And that's mediated by the flow of nutrients and water, as well as things like organic matter, so the carbon that's in trees and the soil and such coming into our waterways. And we think about how that influences the organisms in the lake and the food web, nutrient cycling. A lot of our work is on harmful algal bloom dynamics, as well as carbon cycling and greenhouse gases. And we do this through a combination of sometimes using whole lake manipulations, comparative surveys, long-term data, and high-frequency observations. So lots of different stuff. But what we want to talk about today is research that's focused on carbon cycling and greenhouse gases that really uses high-frequency observations and some long-term data. Next slide, please. So why care about carbon in inland waters, in our lakes, in our streams, and our wetlands? Well, surprisingly, inland waters are actually a really big component of emissions of greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere. And I give a number there on the slide, but to put that in context, the amount of carbon that's coming out of our lakes as CO2 on an annual basis is the same as the transportation sector for the country of India. So this is a pretty substantial amount that's being emitted. And a lot of that carbon is not actually a part of the lake originally. It came from the surrounding landscape and was transported in. So you can see that organic carbon from the land, and then it's decomposed and that releases the CO2 to the atmosphere. Not all of that happens though. Some of that carbon is stored in the sediments, and so there can actually be really good long-term sequestration of carbon in our lakes sediments as well. Now, most of the lakes in the world are pretty small. They're very low in nutrients and they're pretty remote. However, and next slide, please. Small lakes can be more susceptible to this process of eutrophication, right? Or nutrient enrichment, nitrogen and phosphorus coming in. And we know that human activities around the lake and the watershed are exacerbating that nutrient loading. And with really intense land use change, so both urbanization and agriculture, inland waters are starting to become really nutrient rich. And what this figure that I'm showing here on the left-hand side of the graph, or on the slide, is I have total phosphorus, so that's a measure of nutrient concentration, and phosphorus is really important for algal growth. And then chlorophyll on the vertical axis, and that's the index of algae concentrations, essentially. So very clear, the more nutrients you add to the lake, the more algae you get. Very nutrient-rich lakes can have those really large harmful algal blooms. But the vast majority of lakes, each one of these dots is a lake within the United States. The vast majority of lakes around the world and in the US are in these lower nutrient concentrations. But there are some in this hypereutrophic category, in other words, extremely nutrient enriched, that tend to be around areas that have lots of agricultural production or in urban areas that are just really replete with nutrients. And before I came here to University of Wisconsin, I was actually working in Iowa, where every water body is in this nutrient-rich category. And so that really got us thinking much more about how does extreme nutrient enrichment, this extreme nutrient loading, influence the balance of carbon emissions and storage. And the reason why we don't know much about this is because often, as people who study lakes, we like to do things like build field stations up in northern Wisconsin on very clear waters, right? And study what's going on up there. And so we don't know as much actually about the lakes in our own backyard, like Strickers and Tiedemann's. Next slide, please. And so we have lots of hypotheses about why this extreme nutrient enrichment might actually really influence the carbon cycling. And the one thing I just want you to take away from this graph is that there's a lot of possibilities, or this figure. And I detail them a little bit more on the other side, and I'm happy to go through that in more detail for folks that are interested. But I think one of the main things here that we see as well is when we really start getting a lot of nutrient enrichment, we turn on methane production. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas that's 25 times more potent than CO2. And so we start seeing these very nutrient-rich waters becoming large sources of methane to the atmosphere as well. And so this is one of the things that we hope to be investigating some with our research. Next slide, please. So our research questions are, how does carbon cycle through these very nutrient-rich hypereutrophic waters? And how does this differ from less enriched water bodies? As I mentioned before, we mostly know about these less very nutrient poor water bodies and what's happening there. We know far less, or we know more about those. We know far less about nutrient-rich waters, like we have many of here in Dane County. Lake Mendota would be an example. How does that carbon cycling change in times that aren't the summer? As academics, we often do our research when classes are out and we have more time to focus on research. So we know a lot about how lakes work in the summer, but we know very little about how they work in other times of the year. And just as an example of that, I was out on Strickers and Tiedemann's Pond back in March and just took these two photos. And you can see there's already under the ice aquatic plants that are coming up in Strickers, and Tiedemann's Pond actually had an algal bloom occurring under the ice and what looked like to be a minor fish kill that happened as well. So there's lots of things happening when we aren't looking. And so we want to look some more. And then finally, we're interested in things like how climate change, in particular, how this ice cover and storms are changing and how that's influencing carbon cycling in these waters. And so when we have these questions and our funding and moved here to Wisconsin and started looking around and trying to understand where would be a good place to do this research. And that's how we found Strickers and Tiedemann's. And I'm going to pass it over to Jess to tell you a little bit more about that.
Hi, Eric. So next slide. So yeah, we looked at many different water bodies around Madison, and we landed on Stricker and Tiedemann's ponds being some pretty perfect systems for our research for a multitude of reasons. So one of those is a very well-characterized hydrology in these systems. So they have very clear inlets and outlets that make things very easy for us to measure. We're trying to understand everything that's going into and out of these ponds, so that we can further understand what's happening inside of them. And these systems make it pretty nice to do that, which isn't always the case. They're also have a clear movement of water within these two water bodies. So water is coming in through a forebay, entering Strickers, moving to Tiedemann, and then eventually ending up in Lake Mendota. So that's a pretty cool continuation that we could research more with this project. These systems also have a very well-characterized biology. So the Water Resources Management Program at UW-Madison actually came and did a study on Strickers Pond in 2016, led by Dr. Nita Thompson. And so we have their report that gives us a ton of really valuable information about the types of wildlife and the types of plants and things that we might be expecting in Strickers Pond. And we expect Tiedemann to be fairly similar. These ponds are also naturally formed glacial kettle lakes. So rather than many of the ponds that are around Madison that are man-made stormwater ponds, these ponds were naturally formed and then have some stormwater retrofitting later on added, but they're natural systems that we can work with. They're also a tractable size. So we're able to get a canoe onto these ponds and maneuver across the whole water body pretty easily, as well as it's very important when you're doing a study like this to have an understanding of what's going on in the watershed as well as just within the water body itself. So the watershed for these ponds are very manageable size. We understand what's happening in them. Whereas if we get into a system more like Mendota, the watershed blows up along with the size of the water body, and that makes it a lot harder to understand and connect things that are happening in the watershed to what's happening in the water. These ponds also are hypereutrophic, and they fall into the little square, orange square that you see on this graph region on the left side of your screen. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we're planning on sampling, we're hoping to capture all of the major pools and fluxes of carbon throughout the ponds year round using a combination of high frequency sensors, weekly sampling in the center, inlet, and outlet of the ponds, as well as some less frequent biweekly to monthly sampling, focusing more at the processes of this carbon cycling. So of the high frequency sensors, those are going to be deployed in the center of the ponds, and they're going to be measuring dissolved oxygen, temperature, algal pigments, and pH and conductivity every 15 minutes. So then in addition to that very high frequency sensor data, we'll also have weekly sampling data that's looking at things like nitrogen and phosphorus nutrient concentrations coming in and out of the pond as well as within the ponds, different types of carbon, greenhouse gas concentrations, and different solids that are within the water bodies. And then that will all be supplemented by the less frequent sampling of different processes type such as methane production or internal phosphorus loading measurements.
Thanks, Jess. Thank you, Eric. And so I think just to follow up a bit on that, thinking about deploying these sensors, we would do that from buoys that would be in the locations that Jess indicated on the previous slide. However, we're very aware that these are, neighborhood ecosystems, and people seem to have a real love of these ecosystems, which has been great when we've been out walking and talking with folks about them. And so we'd want to be really careful to protect the view shed as well. And so we have ways of camouflaging those buoys. They're very small, low profile, and using things like black spray paint just so that they wouldn't be noticeable at all when you're looking. And so if there's any concerns with that, we're certainly happy to field those and work on problem solving. We would like to do this study for 3 years on the 2 ponds. And the reason for that, I think this spring is an excellent example. We are having a late cold spring, right? Things change from year to year. And it seems like our year to year is getting much more variable, right, with climate change. And so instead of just having a snapshot of 1 year, we would like to look at that within year variability as well. As Jess mentioned, that those sensor data would be augmented with weekly sampling from a canoe or kayak. And we intend for that to usually happen on Monday or Tuesday mornings and by trained lab personnel. So Jess would often be accompanying. And we also have some undergraduates that are working with us. They would be trained by us and supervised. We'd be in UW vehicles so that it would be official and whatnot, and are happy to, if there are other concerns or ideas, so that it's clear that this isn't just random folks going out on the water necessarily. We also, our personnel will have cards that they're carrying with them that they can pass out to folks that are interested, giving a bit of info on our project, pointing them to our project website, and giving our contact information if anyone in the community has questions or concerns. In addition to that, we are very strongly believe in our lab that data are, this is funding that's coming from the National Science Foundation data. This is taxpayer dollars. The data, the publications, as well as our insights from this project need to be made available. And perhaps from that previous slide, looking at some of the parameters we're going to be measuring, that might be things that are useful for folks on this commission or others in the city, in terms of understanding a bit more about the water quality and dynamics in these systems. And so we're always, of course, we are happy to make those quality controlled data available, our publications, and would be happy to provide periodic updates on progress and any educational presentations for general audiences that may be requested. Definitely want to make sure that we're being good citizens. And speaking of that and thinking more about a more general audience, I'll pass it over to Helen to just give a little bit about the community water monitoring network we're developing.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Eric. So taking a little bit of a step back, but still including what we've been talking about this evening on Strickers and Tiedemann's, we are developing and launching a new community science program called the Community Water Monitoring Network. And our goal here is to bring people together who have shared interests around exploring more of the ponds and small water bodies in our backyards and neighborhoods and things like that. And bringing them together, giving a scientific experience and collecting data that both augment some of the research goals we've been talking about this evening and can play different roles as well when we're talking about water quality improvement, conservation, and active stewardship. So our goal in the launching of this program is to start this summer with a couple of free and interactive educational events that we are calling Pond Exploration Days. And those will take place in June and July at various parks around Madison and Middleton and Fitchburg. And then from there, we're looking to do more active recruitment of more long-term volunteers and community members who would be interested in doing regular monitoring on ponds. So we, as part of our original survey, also identified ponds and parks that we would consider safe and useful and accessible sites for this volunteer monitoring program. We would create and loan out, we would have trainings, and we would create and loan out monitoring kits, and all that would be part of the water monitoring network. And as I said, this is a program we're going to be launching very soon. So we'll be doing more focused advertising in the coming months, as well as getting a website underway and some more information to everyone. But as I said, some of these ponds and sites are in Middleton as well, so that could be of particular interest to this commission, but we're hoping to do a broad advertising strategy, and anybody who's interested in joining our network is more than welcome.
Thank you, Helen. And next slide, Eric. So thank you so much for your time and allowing us to present. We'd be happy to field any questions, and we also have our contact information here if something arises later. But thank you so much for your time.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Ken Potter. Yeah, what are your hypotheses? Are you testing some hypotheses, and what are they? And
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in particular, we're hypothesizing that what we would normally expect in less enriched waters, the sort of the drivers or the mechanisms that control carbon cycling and particularly greenhouse gas production rates, are not the same drivers and mechanisms that occur in these very hypereutrophic, particularly shallow waters. And we have things like, for example, the way that nitrate is processed through denitrification, as well as those internal phosphorus loading components that are actually doing more of driving the bus, so the internal production, as opposed to the external inputs, which is sort of the overwhelming narrative of carbon cycling ideas at this time. And so we have some preliminary data from my work in Iowa that demonstrates that actually what is driving this carbon cycling and particularly greenhouse gas production is much different in these very nutrient rich systems because of the way that both the organisms and the system handle those excess nutrients.
okay, yeah. And these streams are not, these ponds are nothing like they were naturally. They're expanded tremendously, and obviously affected heavily by urban, and that from the WRM studies and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been really fascinating to be digging into those. I've actually gone down a bit of a rabbit hole of looking at old obituaries that mention Stricker's Pond in particular.
Oh, yeah.
And apparently the American lotus patch has been a recurring and large thing. One obituary claimed that people came from miles around to come see the American lotus and Strickers. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of try to track and put together how these systems have changed over time.
Okay, great. Well, I'd love to be kept informed on as you go along.
Absolutely.
Really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is Warren Giebert. I like your study real well, and I'm glad you're doing it. And like Ken mentioned, I hope you keep us informed to come back to our meetings and show us the progress. I have a question on you're going to do a water and a chemical budget for ponds. Is that correct?
The data that we are collecting could be, yes, used to create essentially both a carbon and a nutrient budget for the ponds.
Okay, I have one question on phosphorus. So you'll be measuring phosphorus loads, and I've had a question over the past number of years on the phosphorus loading you get from the atmosphere. I got a swimming pool and had it for 45 years, and we never had a phosphorus problem for the last 5 years. And now most swimming pools in this area have a big phosphorus loading, and it's caused a lot of problems with operating the swimming pool, but no one has a good feel for how much phosphorus is coming from the atmosphere. Is that something you think might be worth looking at, like in rain or deposition?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very significant.
Yeah, that atmospheric deposition can be really large. And actually some of the lakes that I worked on in Iowa, being on the edge of the Great Plains, as well as having a lot of erosion on the landscape because of all the agriculture, upwards of 15% of the annual budget in some of those lakes could come from atmospheric deposition. And these are lakes that are very nutrient rich. So 15% is a big chunk of that. So yes, that would certainly be part of what we would be looking at. And at this time for this summer, don't have plans on putting out our own sampling gear to test that. But I think there are also some national atmospheric and deposition sites around the area that we can rely on for some of those data and work in it as a part. So that certainly could be something that we could help to shed some light on.
Okay, sounds good, because I think it's something that other chemical budgets for some of our other sites don't take into account. There is a significant loading taking place.
Yeah. Yeah, great point.
This is Jim. I got a couple questions too. Thanks for your presentation. Very interested to see how this all plays out, and certainly supportive of it. I assume you can work out the coordination with access and whatnot through Eric and the city staff. Do you plan to leave the instruments in place year round, and during ice periods they'll be intact? Is that the plan?
Yes, for the sensors that we shown in all of those measurements, those would be in during the ice-free periods. Under the ice, if allowed, we would like to deploy there's some just dissolved oxygen sensors. Sometimes you don't get them back in the winter, and the other sensor is extremely expensive and the dissolved oxygen sensor is much cheaper. So that's the calculus on that. Not that we don't expect really cool algal dynamics. I just don't want to risk the instrument.
Yeah, I don't know if those ponds freeze right to the bottom or not. They
Yeah.
They aren't that deep. My only concern with the instruments during the summer, I think you can certainly make them unobtrusive, but I am a little worried about, kids or vandalism. So I don't know what precautions you have for that. That's your, decision to make. That Tiedemann Pond's only outlet is the pump station itself, correct? That's the only way out. Okay. And then thirdly, just to ask quickly, you're aware of other citizen monitoring efforts in the area from Rock River and from DNR?
Yeah, we are aware of some of those, and would certainly want to both contribute to those groups and not duplicate effort or step on any toes. And so if there's any concerns there or things that this commission knows about, or you all, we would be happy to hear that. We are aware of the DNR one.
Okay, the other one that comes to mind is,
Jim, you're muted.
I hit the wrong button. It's the Rock River Coalition. You can just Google that or whatever. Eric knows about it also, because Middleton is a member of that, I believe. Eric, no, we're Mamswap. I apologize, but the Rock River Coalition does do some monitoring, citizen monitoring also.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Warren, the mayor has his hand up if you want to recognize him.
Pardon?
The mayor has his hand up for
Okay.
a question.
Gerda, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Warren, and thank you, Eric and Grace. You have made a great selection of the ponds. I know both the ponds really well. And we have one group called Friends of Kettle Ponds, and I think Eric probably already told you. And so there are a lot of, well, it used to be more active than it's now, but there are a lot of people who will be willing to help you. And well, I maybe help you sometime too, but so just to let you know that there will be a lot of help available. It looks like you have already done your homework, so you know that the water is pumped out of this one, and we have installed a larger pump than what it used to be. And you also know that the water flows from Sticker to the Tiedemann Pond, and it's all sort of a stormwater coming from all various neighborhoods, and you probably know all the catchment area and stuff. So you already know work done by the students from Anita Thompson, which Eric knows very well. And so there's a more papers which may be available on Tiedemann Pond from previous studies. I may have available, I have to look. So if you needed some of those, I may be able to dig them out. So I think great selection. I'd be more than happy to help you. And so looks like a super project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yes, that's very helpful. And yes, that work by the students with Anita Thompson has been very helpful for us understanding, and Eric has been also very helpful in sharing of information, and we're very appreciative of that. And any additional information that folks have, we would appreciate that. It's hard to start in on studying a new system and not feel like you know it as well. And so while we get to know it, we want to make sure that we also rely and use the wisdom and knowledge that others have before us about these systems. So thank you for that. And we would look forward to having your help.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to meet with you at some stage whenever you guys would like to. So yeah, just let me know. So
Wonderful. Thank you.
Eric knows how to contact me. So
Thank you.
You had to move to Wisconsin from Iowa to find some lakes that were not impoundments. Is that the deal?
That is a big part of it. Yes.
Welcome.
There's only 25 natural lakes by some counts left in Iowa.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, I know. I lived in Iowa for a number of years, so I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thanks a lot. We appreciate your presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item of business then is Greenway Center.
Yes. So 3 of you should be familiar with this from a couple of years ago. You got Justin Zamparty and Dwayne Johnson are here to talk about it. We're really just at concept stage. They did submit some updated information, which I've only been able to give a cursory review to, but I think that's, you know, at this concept level, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty, I don't think. But, you know, your concerns the last time were with discharging into the greenway behind this site. And you would approve fees in lieu of infiltration and a diversion down the Pleasant View Road ditch. Pleasant View Road in subsequent years has now been designed. So situations changed a little bit. We'll have to discuss that, but I think I'll let Justin or Dwayne give us a brief overview of what this site looks like.
So Eric, I was hoping to kind of give a brief introduction of the project and look at some of the colored information in the architectural portion, and then Justin can get more into the nitty-gritty details of the stormwater.
I just asked Dwayne, we have a very full agenda tonight, so
Sure thing.
please be concise.
Right. So we're here are lots 3 and 4 of the Greenway Center development. We're east of the Pleasant View Golf Course, and PPD would be to our north. The site is approximately 6 acres currently, but some of that will be taken by the right of way for Pleasant View, and then some also dedication for bike path and easement related stuff. The site is extremely challenging with extreme slopes around all sides of it. Very dense rock, shallow beneath the surface, and then the Pleasant View Road reconstruction, and then how we connect to utilities, and there are existing easements as well. Our proposed schematic is shown here with 3 buildings, each having about 125 apartment units. We're using a single point access, which is actually the point that was planned off of Pleasant View Road in the previous development. And that access leads to some surface parking and then 2 levels of underground parking in each building. The tan area along the long axis of each building is the basement parking below is larger than the footprint of the 8 stories above. And that would be an area of plaza. And then we would have some green roof on that as well. And then south of building 3 is a single story clubhouse area, and then a pool and a pool deck. And then if we could go to the next one really quick. Here's one of the views from Pleasant View Road, which, as you know, is getting taken down in elevation quite substantially. And there's an overpass planned for the bike path to cross Pleasant View Road. And then that's our single point of entry, which would be leading uphill to get back to the natural grades that are existing on the site currently. And then the bottom one is a different view from the top of that entry point. And then we did some long views more for the golf course committee that we met with on Monday night. And then remaining stuff is Justin's from Beer Bicker.
Thank you, Dwayne.
So this is kind of the existing conditions plan that, as Dwayne kind of mentioned, you know, there's significant lowering of Pleasant View Road, and the site currently kind of drains to the northwest and southeast. If you can go to the next slide there.
I think, should I go down to like the utility plan perhaps?
Yeah, on this one right here, I think is good. So what we've tried to do with the layout is, you know, work with the topography of the site and the bedrock in placing these buildings and working with the grading. So kind of coming up from the entrance drive on the north off of Pleasant View Road, you know, we come into the site, the first drive goes down to first level of underground parking, and then as you come up that drive, there's then another level of underground parking, and then you kind of continue up that drive to the south into a kind of a central parking lot area between the buildings. And with kind of with the topography dropping off, you know, to the north and south and east, you know, the bedrock generally follows that topography. And so if you look at kind of the building one on the north end, you know, the bedrock elevation is roughly at that first level of underground parking. And then, you know, it continues to drop off to the north. So we're trying to minimize the amount of rock removal and blasting using the buildings across those areas. As we have kind of that central parking lot area, then again, as the topography drops off, we've got drives that go to the north and south for 2 levels of underground parking for each of those remaining buildings as well. And then central in that parking lot area is where we're planning to have an underground stormwater management facility. You know, we've got the elevation, you know, tentatively set kind of right at that top of bedrock elevation to remove or, you know, minimize the rock removal. All of the building roof areas will be discharged to that, you know, the parking lot, and then also all the underground drive entrances will have to be pumped to that underground system. As Dwayne mentioned, we are planning for some green roof areas on the lower plaza deck areas, so that kind of long linear portions of on the back side of the building to incorporate some green roof systems in those areas. If you want to maybe go to the next slide, Eric, it's kind of the utility plan. So really, all the stormwater management will kind of be centrally located underneath the parking lot with the discharge point heading out to Pleasant View Road. Eric, I apologize, but the one other map I'd like to show is kind of towards the end of the stormwater report, which is quite a few pages ahead. I don't know if you can type in a page number or not.
If you know it, I can.
Yeah, it's 135 of our PDF. There you go. So as Dwayne mentioned, you know, the site drops off pretty steeply. So the areas kind of around the perimeter, which are hatched in the red hatch, are areas that really aren't feasible to capture stormwater runoff and treat. And so those are primarily green area, lawn areas that are going to be, similar to what the current state of how the site is draining off. So we've got that OP1, which is heading to the east, OP2, which heads to the southeast, and then OP3 out to Pleasant View Road. And so what we've looked at from a preliminary stormwater perspective is really that blue line is what we anticipate the areas that we can capture and treat the stormwater runoff. And so for that area in blue, we're able to hit our peak runoff rate and volume control, our TSS removals. The areas that we're short on and are requesting fee in lieu is for infiltration and recharge. And so with that, I guess I'll leave it up for any comments or questions.
Are you confident of the kind of infiltration rate you're going to get when you, for water, you're going to keep on site and infiltrate? Do you have any measurements of that? Or, I mean, you're going to be excavating to these areas, right? And do you have any idea what those infiltration rates are going to be?
I think it was outlined in the previous report. Right now, we're not showing any like bioretentions or infiltration systems because of the bedrock on the site. What we're getting the infiltration from is really just the green spaces that are being provided on site.
And that's going to meet the ordinance?
Well, we fall short for infiltration. I think we're at a 70% infiltration rate as opposed to the 90%.
Justin, maybe I could step in here. Ken, the last proposal on this site, the direction from Water Resources was to pay a fee in lieu for infiltration due to the bedrock conditions. And I think they went and did another round of soils investigations and brought Steve Gaffield in as a geologist, so to speak, and talk about, if there was water infiltrated into this, I think what was represented as permeable bedrock, what was going to happen. And I think the commission decided that you didn't want to take the risk of forming surface flow paths and springs
right
down that slope. And so the decision was you're going to divert, the bulk of this watershed, put it in the Pleasant View Road ditch. The complicating factor now is that Pleasant View Road has been designed without accommodating this 5-acre watershed. It drains down to Quarry Road and over to a proposed treatment pond close to South Pond. So if we want to stick with that philosophy, we should, make that recommendation so that there is opportunity to put a change order into the Pleasant View Road plans. And there'll have to be some redesign that gets done for that too.
But this site can meet the peak flow requirements. Is that what you're saying? To Pleasant View?
I think they had a design in 2020 that met all of the requirements, but the infiltrative facilities were discharging to the east.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Is your
So
question, Jim, about this
more
one,
water
maybe not?
coming. All right. Well, the other thing I want to make sure I bring up, and I think it's been resolved, my memory as a major concern was the need for, or back 2 years ago, putting the sanitary line through the Conservancy. That now has gone away. That sanitary line will go to Pheasant Branch right away. Is that correct?
Rich, do you know the answer to that question? I think it's yes.
I thought that they were gonna be able to go to the road with that, and they were gonna put a sanitary line in Pleasant View, but the timing was poor for the last development.
But now with the delay and all that, it might work out with the road construction to put that sanitary to the road.
Correct. The timing would be better for this project being a couple years later than originally expected.
Yeah.
However, I don't know if Pleasant View Road is really on schedule either right now. There's some issues brewing with that too.
Okay, I will go on record that if the line had to go through the Conservancy to the east, I'd have a large concern about that.
Right, yeah.
You know, since 2020, we've taken a different stance on fees in lieu by the commission members. They've not wanted to accept fees in lieu of so readily. So I think we'd like to have the developer meet our standards and not take fees in lieu.
Well, is the concern that the water, I'm asking this to Mr. Zampardi, I lost your first name, sorry. Justin, the water can infiltrate into the bedrock, but you don't have this, you don't have the separation that you need. And the concern is it might have more lateral flow than vertical flow and get out to the sides of the fractured bedrock. Wasn't that one of our issues?
Yeah, yeah.
So Warren, I'm suggesting that if we require this to be met, we may end up creating problems for ourselves along the face of those outcroppings.
What about more green roofs? More, depending more on green roofs.
Yeah, I believe that's certainly an option. You know, we're planning on, and you can see on this map for a green roof system on portions of each of the building roofs on the lower level terrace roof areas.
But what about on the buildings themselves? Is that an option? I know that's a structural issue.
Yeah, you know, that's certainly something we can look at and talk with the owner and see, you know, if we can work some more into the upper areas.
Eric, when you were talking about taking the water down adjacent to Pleasant View Road, are you talking about infiltration along the ditch line of Pleasant View Road, or the possibility of that?
No, because it'll be sewered, Warren. You know, we'll have to upsize the sewer, number one. Well, number one, we'll have to pay Strand to analyze the new watershed, and there may be a developer's cost to that as well if we go this route. But no, would not gain infiltration necessarily by making the diversion to Pleasant View.
So there's going to be a storm sewer on Pleasant View, right? It's not going to be a ditch. Right?
It's going to be
Correct.
storm sewer.
To be stored, yeah, right. So
Yeah,
that's
the ditch was proposed because the previous development was going to be in before the Pleasant View Road construction.
yeah. I'm just worried about as we get bigger and bigger rains. You know, what's going to happen with really big rains? Where's the water going to go?
Well, it'll all be conveyed to the underground system, and then ultimately it'll be in any larger significant events, they'll go down the drive out to Pleasant View Road.
That's the overflow then out of their stormwater system?
Correct.
And how is Pleasant View Road going to handle that?
To the storm sewer.
At our road we have.
Well, Justin, you'd have multiple overtopping points, I think, if your underground chamber became full, wouldn't you?
On that P4 would potentially shoot out the other way. The other ones are there wouldn't be an overflow route. Those areas would be designed to be pumped for the 100-year storm event to the underground system.
Hmm.
And I'll bring this up now, Justin. I think you guys are stuck with the new Dane County ordinance for this site, which is going to require 200-year. And there's some, first half inch through green infrastructure. So there are some things. And I know those were just preliminary numbers you sent, but the county would not allow not meeting TSS and not meeting rate control like that. Fees in lieu is not an option for that. Even
Correct.
though our ordinance says it is, the county won't allow it.
So this is actually just for our information and a concept.
I have asked you to make a recommendation on the general theory here of what you want to see.
Well, we got to meet the county ordinance, and I guess I want to see the calcs on how that's going to be done.
But would you allow fees in lieu for infiltration? And would you allow discharge to the east? Or do you want to recommend that this still be diverted down Pleasant View Road?
Man, it's hard to say without seeing. I mean, maybe they ought to just look at both options and see what options work the best. But there's going to be a lot of impervious area here. That's what it's going to make this really hard.
And Eric, before I would say discharge to the east or the north on some overflow conditions, I'd like to know, well, under what conditions would that occur? Which storms we're talking about and what part of those storms, not just yes or no.
Well, when I say discharge to the east, I meant in any storm. Like Justin would conceivably come up with a biofilter or perhaps another underground storage system and let the discharge go to the east. The difference being it would emerge as a concentrated flow in some fashion and not be trickling down the sides of a wooded slope. They would be limited, just as he's doing now, to the existing discharge rates, but I mean, if I'm understanding your 2020 concern right, it's for erosion down that slope,
Right.
which is a hard problem to solve when you collect the water in a pond and then want to have a discharge.
Yep.
That 2020 condition though, Eric, was because they had infiltration basin close to that slope. And that's not the case here. This is a different design.
If I'm reading this right, the red areas, the red hatched, are going to be vegetated and they will slope toward the perimeter, the east and south and west of the site and over the. So it's no different than what we have today, is it? I mean, right now the slope is going that way. It's wooded, but it's still flowing that direction, surface flow. Am I right?
That is correct.
But the watershed boundary in the existing condition, Jim, is right, off the edge of Pleasant View.
It all slopes to the east, right? So there's more watershed going today than would under post-development condition. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Except it is wooded, and so it's got a soil that can manage it. We've never had any problems off of that, right? water coming off that side, so.
I mean, I don't know if that, you know, you've seen wooded areas that have pretty bare soil underneath the trees also. You know, if it's a better turf condition with maybe it's a prairie grass type vegetation, it might be.
Yeah, well, I think it gets, a lot of this most of it goes in the ground, obviously. Nobody's complained on the other side, right? There's no gullying or anything going on the east side.
Do you plan, once the bedrock's exposed, to do some kind of infiltration test on it to see what the infiltration rate really is?
I mean, further tests can certainly be done, but I think there's been concerns with infiltration in close proximity to the bedrock, with just the unknowns of how that water is going to migrate through the bedrock, if it's going to go laterally or, horizontally.
But you said you're going to infiltrate 70% of it.
That's done just from the green spaces on the site, not through any sort of stormwater facility that's holding the water and infiltrating it in.
None of these underground storage units are exfiltrating, correct? They're all solid?
This would be a closed system, correct?
Yeah. And
so you could build an infiltration basin someplace. Is that a possibility to get the other 30%?
I don't know. I mean, really, you couldn't try to squeeze something in around the perimeter just because of the steep side slopes to, tie back in around the property line.
I would like to suggest I'd better have maximize the ET and possible storage from the green roofs and possible green roofs on top of the buildings themselves. Maximize as much. It wouldn't be infiltration, and I'm not sure I want much more infiltration than into that bedrock, but it would be stay on at least.
Yeah, I certainly think it would be more cost effective to incorporate more green roof than it would be to remove additional bedrock in order to get, the required separation distances with any sort of infiltration system. So we can certainly look at possibilities for additional green roof areas.
I would do that, yeah.
So at this time, do you have enough guidance to go back and look at these infiltration concerns and also look at how you can take care of the 200-year flood?
Yeah, certainly. I guess the direction, I'm a little unclear on is if we're okay with diverting the runoff towards Pleasant View Road or taking it to the east.
If you took it to the east, where would it go?
Well, I mean, we would still need to collect it similar to how we have it. And then, there would be some sort of storm pipe outlet, which would be a single point discharge. So a pipe with the flared end section somewhere, pointing towards the east, probably, somewhere around building 3 on the right-hand side.
Eric, if this is me speaking, if Pleasant View Road stormwater conveyance system can be designed to handle this, I'd certainly would prefer to have it go out that way as opposed to the east.
Yeah, I agree, but I guess we'd like to see that, wouldn't we? How it's going to be handled?
Well, it's a question of the road designers now, right? Figuring out the timing of the discharge from this location versus the whole system they got out there or will have out there.
Well, it's probably also a question of how long the developer can wait uh, for us to answer that question. And how much of that cost might be borne by the developer.
Yeah. There's no schedule right now for the Pheasant Branch Road construction.
I was ready to go almost, and then I think current delay is due to the railroad crossing just south of 14.
Great.
So I think they've scuttled construction for this year and planning on next year.
So I guess I still don't understand where the stormwater is going to go then. What do you want from us, Justin, to tell us, say, go to the east?
That's your option that I asked you for. The way Justin has this design, he's got it draining to Pleasant View Road.
Okay,
And I asked you guys if you wanted to mimic your recommendations from 2 years ago, which is to drain it to Pleasant View Road. Given that it's going to cause, some redesign of that project, potentially some redesign of the downstream treatment pond, land acquisition, upsizing the storm sewers between.
so it sounds like we're in agreement to go to Pleasant View Road, but what is it going to look like? You just have a discharge pipe going into the ditch in Pleasant View Road?
Well, he can have, there won't be a ditch for him, but he can have a direct storm connection. And
Go culvert along.
overflows would be carried by the street cross section eventually.
Yeah.
No different than anywhere else.
And that's what we're currently showing. It's a little difficult to see because the line is right underneath the blue line of the drive that's going out, but the connection, yeah, is right there at the inlet in Pleasant View.
And then there's this storm line is heading north to Quarry Road.
Eric, help me out here. What am I missing? I mean, I realize we're talking, there's a volume issue here, but as far as flows go, the stormwater conveyance in Pleasant View Road was designed to convey a flow under certain size storms, assuming this site was undeveloped.
Right.
And now we're matching the peak flows under a post-development condition. And so I know timing might be an issue, but the flow shouldn't be any different, right?
Well, Justin's matching the peak flow from the total site, and you only had a quarter of an acre draining to Pleasant View, and now you're
I
getting
get it.
5
I get it.
acres.
Okay, I'm with you. Sorry about that.
So is there going to be a storm sewer along Pleasant View Road then?
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know where to go from here. I guess you've got our comments, so.
Well, are you guys in consensus? Still drain to Pleasant View? Is that a yes or a no?
Yes, but I'd like to see more green roofs.
And that would be your second recommendation is
Yes.
investigate more green roofs or ways to increase stay on.
Right. I mean, we could have a real mess here. We're making a huge change on this hillside slide here.
I mean, the option of putting a drop structure over the east side to carry some water to the east. I mean, that's probably not a very good solution either, right? I mean, it would avoid the erosion issues, but that's a heck of a drop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
I'm
think
not
Dwayne,
sure.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we can certainly take a look at other areas for adding more green roof to the building.
Yeah, definitely.
I agree with Ken's comments and Eric, if you're asking us to push
Okay,
the water to Pheasant Branch.
For some reason, Jim, I have a real hard time hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just saying, I agree with what Ken said, that to push the water to Pheasant Branch and maximize the green roof options.
Well, I think you got our feedback, so I don't think at this time you need a motion, do you?
Justin, is that clear to you?
Yep, I think so.
Yeah, I think you have reached consensus. I don't think you necessarily need to make a motion.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we should move along more.
The next item then of business is the Lake Street apartment building.
Yes. Drew Mears with Veer Becker is here to discuss this. I will only speak briefly. This is meeting requirements except for recharge. You know, it's right next to the lake, so in a practical sense, I'm not sure recharge really does a lot for us. I asked Drew to make some design changes. I have not had time to review what he sent back. But, you know, the design changes I asked him to make were not going to increase recharge. They were just going to potentially increase stay on and vegetative filtration and things like that. This development was on the table before the county's ordinance was revised, so I don't see that they need to meet the recently revised county ordinance. So that's where this stands. And Drew, maybe you can address, you know, if you were able to successfully implement any of the suggestions I threw at you.
Yeah. Thanks for the intro, Eric. So like you mentioned, this is 6100 Lake Street. This is the old Captain Bill's restaurant site. Very close to the lake there, just up the road a block or so. So like he said, the one requirement we are not able to meet on site is the recharge requirement. As he pointed out, we're close to the lake, so groundwater is a concern. There's also some shallow bedrock in portions of the site, and there's also some thick uniform clay soils that are also kind of preventing that recharge as well. What we've kind of implemented to meet the other stormwater goals is an underground wet detention system that's going to pretty much capture all of the site water except for kind of what's on the east and south perimeters, those small areas there. And then we also have some areas of green roof kind of at grade there. There's an underground parking system that extends kind of below the at grade parking. So all of those green spaces we've designed to have 12-inch thickness of the soil, of the growing media, to maximize kind of those areas, as well as kind of a grassed swale on the north that's primarily taking off-site water, but that will get us a little bit of infiltration, recharge, TSS removal. Some of the items that Eric recommended were the sidewalk there. It's kind of running north-south in front of the building. We've pitched that back towards the green roof area just to kind of get a little more biofilter from those areas or for those areas. And then we also we weren't incorporating that grassed swale just because it's primarily taking off-site water, but we have incorporated those into our models just to kind of show the benefits that those are providing the site. He also asked us to look at maybe potential biofilter there in that landscape island to the west. Yep. Our concerns there are just, we're very limited on kind of usable green space on the site for the residents here. So we wanted to keep that open, or proposing a small dog walk area through there. We'd also have concerns kind of just with infiltration in general through there, and in putting that around that underground system, potentially causing structural issues and concerns through that area. He also wanted us to look at green roof areas on the roof of the building. The concern there would be structural. Right now, we're planning most of that to be solar arrays to kind of help with the green push for this site. So any areas that we added green roof up there, we would have to remove portions of that solar array and cut back on that. So that was kind of the trade-off of what you guys would like to see. I know the developer liked the idea of the solar, since we already have the green roof kind of at grade there. So he would prefer that up there, but obviously open to recommendations and thoughts. Like Eric said, we're meeting all the requirements except for that recharge, which on this site is difficult just with existing constraints and separation of the soils. I think we're at about 60% right now, the requirement. So there'd be a small fee in lieu requested for that. It's pretty straightforward. So if you guys have any questions or items you want to discuss further, I guess I'll open it up.
I'll just say, given the location and where you're at, I have no problem with this request for fee in lieu.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, we're right at the groundwater level, lake level is the same thing.
Yeah.
Can we have a formal motion for this one, Warren?
I'll move to approve the request for fee in lieu of, subject to final review and concurrence from staff.
A second.
Okay, all in favor of approval, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, the motion's carried.
Okay, thank you, Drew.
Yep, thank you, guys.
Next item of business then is our stormwater ordinance. But before we got into that, I wanted to give a little background on some of the things looking at our volume control. So I got a brief presentation that I'd like to make. We've been aware that increased urbanization and increase in precipitation has increased the volume of flow in Pheasant Branch. And we started working on our ordinance. It became apparent to me that we're missing one of the major components, and that's evapotranspiration loss that we have when we increase the impervious area. And hopefully these following slides will kind of illustrate that.
And Warren, let me interrupt you. I have to say that this presentation is revised from what was included in the agenda packets.
Oh, yeah, I had an error in the first one. So don't show that one. That probably wouldn't have noticed it anyway. Okay. When we developed the ordinance, our primary concern was developing controls to protect us from increased flood peaks due to urbanization. And later we revised the ordinance to help reduce sediment and phosphorus loads. And we have been recently concerned about the volume controls in closed watersheds, and we kind of addressed that by increasing the infiltration requirements. Volume control is really important for Lake Mendota flooding, and also the impact on Pheasant Branch Conservancy, as well as our closed ponds like Tiedemann Gravers and Stricker's Pond. So the first slide here is one that I've shown before through 2010, but it didn't increase like it is right now. So essentially this is a cumulative annual stream flow in CFS days by year at the gating station at Parmenter Street for the period 1975 to 2021. And as you could see, 4 different segments there, it's increasing exponentially as we go through the years. And the next slide is the cumulative stream flow for Pheasant Branch again, with cumulative precipitation at Madison And again, you could see that the cumulative stream flow is increasing faster than the precipitation. So this means this probably effect of urbanization is probably causing the increase. And as we said before, the increase we always thought was the increase in impervious areas is causing increased runoff, which is true, but we ignored the effect of ET. So the next one.
I'm sorry, Warren, we ignored the effect of what?
We ignored the effect of ET because when you have impervious areas developed, you've lost that ET component.
Okay.
You used to have plants and vegetation and trees growing there, which had ET, and we didn't take that into account.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So I thought I'd look at a basin that has no urbanization to see what these graphs look like. And so this is the same kind of graph of the stream flow at Pheasant Branch at Black Earth Creek. And as you could see in this one, it's much more linear, except for the last 3 years when we had those very high precipitation events, which caused the increase in stream flow. So the next one. This is the same kind of one with the cumulative annual stream flow with cumulative precipitation and a much more linear approach or relationship than we saw with the exponential relationship on Pheasant Branch. This one surprised me, and I just included because with all the ET loss or increased volume because loss of ET in Pheasant Branch, I expected to see Pheasant Branch to have much sharper increase than Black Earth Creek. So this is a comparison of cumulative annual stream flow for Pheasant Branch and for Black Earth in CFS per square mile. And you could see that Pheasant Branch is a lot lower than Black Earth Creek. And the reason for that is because there is no groundwater inflow from the South Fork and very little on the North Fork, where Black Earth Creek has about 11 inches per year of recharge, where Pheasant Branch has 1.5 inches per year, one of the lowest in the state versus the highest. And the cumulative effect, as you can see, it takes place. Next slide. So to get an idea of how much ET we're really talking about, this is a map of the average annual precipitation from 1969 to 2008 that I prepared for a low flow report that I'm doing. And you could see that precipitation varies from a high of 34.5 in the southwest to a low of about 30 inches in the northeast. So then next slide. Oh, this was, okay, this is average annual runoff. And the difference between the two is an estimate of ET. In this case, you could see that the lowest runoff takes place in the southwest, like 8 or 9 inches per year, and the highest runoff is in 16. So we have the highest ET occurring in the southwest and the lowest ET occurring in the north. And that's because of the type of vegetation that we have, or crops, and also warmer temperatures. And one thing that urbanization points out on the west over there, on the east over by Milwaukee, we could see that the runoff is much higher. And this is because of the effects of urbanization. So there we have the high runoff of almost 18 inches taking place in the downtown urbanized area. And this is based on analysis of 218 gauging stations.
Wow.
Warren?
Yeah.
How do you explain, I'm confused about the southwest versus northeast on runoff, where, in the southwest, I'm picturing more agricultural lands, less cover year round. In the north, I'm picturing cover year round and more, permanent vegetation, and yet more runoff in the northeast.
ET is much higher in the farming areas, especially with corn.
They use
Corn
conservation. They do a fair amount of conservation in the driftless area too.
Well,
I mean, it's not nearly what it used to be.
But this is based on 218 gauging stations, so it's pretty much, it does sort of surprising. That's why I did it. There's a big contrast you would expect with the higher precipitation and they have much equal or more runoff in the southwest.
yeah.
Okay, the next slide. So this one here, I put together a water budget, and you can't see the top part of it. I guess you could zoom out a little bit. Eric, can you make that a? You can't see the top. Oh, there, a little more. This is a average annual water budget for the South Fork that I estimated for the period 1978 to 82 to show what the effective loss of ET would do. So that's a period that we had stream flow data at the gating station on the South Fork. And looking at that period of time, the average annual precipitation was 32.5 inches. And the groundwater recharge, I estimated halfway between Black Earth, which has 11, and Sugar River, which is about 7. So I guess that the groundwater recharge is 8 inches. Now, in this case, the South Fork is perched and there is no recharge into the stream, so it goes into Lake Mendota. As we shown in the last one, the estimated evapotranspiration is 23 inches. So then looking at the equation that the runoff is equal to the precipitation minus the groundwater loss and ET loss, we come up with 1.5 inches of a runoff for the period. And the recorded at that period was 1.3, which shows that we're pretty close to the real water budget. So if we change urbanization, superimpose urbanization then on the watershed, keeping the same 32.5 inches of precip. And again, in this case, the groundwater recharge does not go into the stream, but we have I assume 40% urbanization with increase of impervious area. So then our evapotranspiration loss is down to 13.8. So our estimated runoff then is up to 10.7 inches. And that's a 700% increase, which shows you why we're having those large changes in those graphs I showed before. So it helps define that it's because of increased precip and some of the loss we're getting from not having as much evapotranspiration. Next slide. And this one is just from the article I had in Stormwater Magazine, where I looked at the North Fork, South Fork, and Pheasant Branch between 2 periods. And this just helps to justify or show the same kind of results I got in the preceding one. So comparing the periods, 1978 to 2013, 2020, for the South Fork, you can see that CFS and CFS days per square mile increased from 19.5 to 143, so about 600%. We're in the North Fork, where we didn't have any urbanization, it only increased to 164%, which is probably the effective increased precipitation. So the next slide. So this is a study that was done by Stoyer and Hunt on the North Fork. And it's just a schematic showing what I'm talking about, where you have precipitation that they put together for our Pheasant Branch at Parmenter gauge, where during that period they had 35 inches of precip and overland flow and interflow going into the stream. And totally, like I said, there's 1.5 inches of base flow in Pheasant Branch, and then the groundwater recharge, there are 6 inches going into the regional system, and evapotranspiration loss of 23.9 inches. So the next slide, please. So what can we do about it? So just thinking about possible changes we might want to look at for our stormwater ordinance to reduce the increased runoff due to ET losses. We could require a developer to provide solutions to reduce the runoff volumes. That could be done by some of the ideas I listed here. Increase plants and trees in open spaces with higher ET. Look at some green infrastructure to increase ET. We could make them look at the volume, the increases in the pond, and provide storage space around the pond to accommodate the increased runoff. Or provide outlet structures to accommodate the increased runoff, and or require the detailed rainfall runoff models that incorporate ET and groundwater to show how ET losses are compensated. Or we could do nothing and just have the city handle the problem as we did with Tiedemann Strickers. And then the next slide is the last one, just shows you the type of model that was used on the North Fork that incorporates evapotranspiration and overland flow and groundwater flow. And I think that's the type of model that would be nice to have for Graver Pond to see if you ran a daily simulation for a 10-year period, we would see what kind of volumes we have in Graver Pond and how we might be able to control them. So any questions?
Yeah, I just would like to say, Warren, this is Gurdeep. This is excellent data, and I'm somewhat surprised at how much loss of evapotranspiration. I mean, this is quite solid. Well, I imagine that it's very solid data, and I was just wondering if you would be willing to present it to the city council, because I don't really think that anybody there on the city council has any idea about this. So I know you made some presentation in the past which were a little bit different than some of the earlier slides, but I think it will be a good idea to present it to the city council at some stage whenever you feel comfortable about it.
Sure. Well, yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. I actually kind of embarrassed that we didn't think about this during the last 50 years.
Well, I'm totally with you. Trees, and green, we need to really push that harder because ET is critical, right? It's a big number in the budget, and we just not. The other problem, other trees we put in, they're so young and immature that it takes some years before they're going to reproduce the ET that we had before when we had mature trees. So it'd be a challenge.
Well, we're looking at Graver Pond watershed right now, and I think they're going to have the same characteristics as we had in the North Fork. I don't think there's part of the basin, the groundwater flow does not go into Graver Pond. Probably it goes towards Conservancy. And so we're going to have large increases in flow volume in the Graver Pond. And I know we got an outlet designed, whether that's going to be adequate to handle those increased volumes or not. I think we should find out before we go ahead and build it. And also, if that's the case, we're going to have a lot more discharges downstream, which is concern to the Conservancy and other people. So it'd be good to have that type of information before we go ahead with Graver Pond. And
So I'm trying to, whenever we talk about the impact of ET, and I fully support, maximizing that wherever we can, but I'm struggling to understand that this is talking about long-term flow regimes and impacts. It doesn't. Well, I should ask as a question. How does it help solve, or does it address the August 21st, 22nd, 2018 type storm? It's not gonna resolve that issue, right? It's not gonna resolve the extreme storms.
no,
as far
I
as
think
flooding goes.
I think it addresses the issues we had in Tiedemann and Strickers over time, that pond levels just accumulate from the increase of accumulation of runoff.
Yeah. Okay.
They increase faster in 2018 form, but every year that it's above normal, we have more runoff going in with no change in discharge.
Yeah, I fully understand and get that. I think if we're going to talk about this to the council or other groups, to try to separate out that issue with people picture, 100-year, 200-year, 6-inch rainfall flooding. We're not. Yes, it has some bearing on it, but it's not going to eliminate those situations, right? The flash flooding conditions.
That's right.
No, but it will help the lakes if
Yeah.
I mean, so because that is an accumulated water. Yeah.
If the lakes can come closer to their target numbers, more quickly, yeah. I just think we need to clarify we're not talking about the flash flooding
No, right.
issue. That's all.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
I have one other question. That is that how solid are these data? And I guess, is this all your data or is it, I'm sure you have checked it. You said you had two different point sources of, sample collection. So I just want to considering how high these values are. So I'm sure Ken and Vaughn, you probably have checked them twice to make sure that they're valid, right?
Well, I don't have actual values of ET, if that's what you mean. That would be, there are probably studies out there that determine ET for different type of plant species and areas. And I guess we could look at that. I got to ET by looking at the subtraction of rainfall from precipitation. And the only thing that's left is ET essentially.
Yeah, so that is accurate, Warren. So, I mean, so don't miss, we are getting good numbers on ET just by the differencing the rainfall and the runoff, so.
It's very impressive data, and that those values they are meaningful. I mean, they're pretty large.
Yeah. I've looked at other model studies that we did on Graver Pond before, and back when Leo House study, and he didn't take into effect the loss of ET. It's just something we overlooked when we look at the water budget.
Excellent job. Looks really good.
Eric,
Sue,
as well as requiring the developer to provide solutions, could we also encourage builders to provide solutions?
you mean like home builders?
Like home builders, as for instance, rain gardens and prairie strips, other things that can be put in a private residential lot.
We can encourage it, certainly. I mean, maybe we could even incentivize it. And they are in process of, rewriting the zoning code currently. And I know Jim made comments on some of that already, and this whole commission is going to be given the opportunity to comment on that. I think with all these ideas, we're still kind of stuck with the developer's amendment that tells us we can't demand more than 90% infiltration. That's
No,
the sticking point.
Anything increase infiltration to 100%, that's not going to do it. That doesn't come close to making up for ET losses. But certainly if they do Graver Pond, they should know what the levels might be after a long period of time of increased runoff. And so we don't have homes being developed in those areas like Hidden Oaks where they have flooding problems in their basement.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, the reason for ET is going to be a rising water table. I mean, the water table is rising. That's why base flows are increasing. And so the only solution to that is the evapotranspiration. So we've got to really promote green trees, particularly. Grass doesn't do much. We cut it. So we keep it so low that the amount of ET from grass is really minimal.
Well, ET from corn is really high.
Yeah.
But corn's only on the field for 3-4 months, so I don't know how it does on an annual basis.
Yeah.
We should all grow corn on our lawns.
And
Corn's a grass, so there you go.
Yeah.
No, trees and shrubs, we need to push those. We got to keep get as many. We have a lot of trees, fortunately, in a lot of places, right? But in new developments, we got to really encourage more tree planting, I think.
And trees that hold more water, like willow trees or
Cottonwoods. Well, more cut. Let's get Greg on the line here, right? Eric, you ready for that?
Yeah, Warren, you want to move to
Sure.
the next item?
Yeah, I don't know how Greg feels about what we just said.
Well, I've been listening, and I'd be interested in, I could talk a long time about this with people on the line here who all know a lot more about this than I do, but I'm not sure that this is the place. But I have some questions, and it'd be interesting to loop in Bill Selbig with his recent study from up in Fond du Lac. So, which is a different take on this, right? On trees, right? You're talking about ET, Warren, and he's really talking about like initial abstraction with his study. So it's interesting.
Okay, let's go on to the ordinance then.
Well, I didn't structure this really in any sense. You guys saw I sent out this Q&A and Greg answered a few of them. Do you want to revisit these? Do you have additional specific questions that, you know, about the Madison ordinance that Greg can answer? I can start out. I have some follow-ups.
I don't know if it's a policy question or what, but to ask Greg, I believe I know when the Madison was going through this process, you did a lot of upfront work with your different stakeholders, elected officials and development communities and all that kind of stuff, builders, contractors, etc. I assume you did that expecting a lot of pushback and trying to see what you could do to ease the process a little bit. You want to comment on that and how many battles, how many scars you got on your back from pushing this thing through?
Well, in fairness, I had a solid tailwind behind me when this was going on, right? So you're right, Jim. We did a lot of outreach. I met with the Madison area home builders, Smart Madison, Smart Growth Madison, a couple other what I would call development advocacy groups. You know, CARPC, all the city committees, a committee of the Common Council, a committee of the Plan Commission. So, I mean, literally this went on for close to a year in terms of pitching this. But really, the amount of pushback that we got was relatively minimal. But, you know, we had some comments from Viridian. Probably they had the biggest comment, and we did address their comment. It was a legit, from their business model, it was certainly a legit concern. And that the thing that's written into the ordinance is Viridian, at least in Madison, I'm not familiar with how much, you know, and what they do in Middleton, but in Madison, Viridian has kind of a fluid business model, meaning, you know, they plat an area, they do a preliminary plat for a huge area, oftentimes, you know, maybe 120 acres. But then they carve off chunks. The modern model is they carve off lots, and I would say 10 to 15, you know, hunks, phases of that preliminary plat. They final plat only like 15, maybe 20 lots at a time. Where when I was a young guy with a lot less gray hair, they would final plat, you know, 100 lots all at one time, right? And they would just hold them and develop them. And the reason they do it in smaller chunks now is they are replatting, I don't know if I'd say constantly, but fairly often now, right? So these plats like Grandview Commons on the city's far east side, that plat has been under development for 20 years, right? I mean, literally the original preliminary plat, and they've replatted portions of it to change the lot sizes and the product to fit with what is selling for them at any given time, right? And so they were very concerned that what would happen is they would plat something, preliminary plat something, do their stormwater management plan, and then we would have an update to the ordinance, and they would come in to replat 20 lots, and they would no longer be in compliance, right? They would have complied with all this stuff, and And we would have said, well, now you have to completely, I'm going to make up a scenario. But what they were concerned about is in 2 years, in 2024, we decide we're going to detain the 500 year, right? And they were going to say, well, I want to replat 15 lots, and you're going to make me redo my entire preliminary plat that is already approved. And so what we wrote in was basically I hesitate to call it a get out of jail free card, but a window where they could replat. They still have to, let's say they replat and they go from a curve number, I'm going to make this up, a curve number of 83 to a curve number of 88. They still have to redo the calcs to address that, but they have to meet the same standards that they met at the time they did the initial plat, not the standards that might be in place at the time they are replatting. Okay. Now, I also said a lot of these plats go 20 years. So if you look at the east side of Grandview Commons, is literally 20 years. If you look at the west side, they tend to sell out faster on the west side, but they still have Cardinal Glen, which is going on about 10. And we gave them, I'd have to look the ordinance, but I think we gave them a 5-year redo without meeting the current ordinance. So in other words, if the plat was recorded in 2020, they on January 1, they have through January 1 of 2025 to replat that and only meet the standards that were in place at the time of the initial platting. If they come in on January 2nd, 2025, now they got to meet whatever standards happen to be in place at that time. So that was probably the biggest, I don't know if I'd call it a concession, but I guess that's what it was, to a business model. And, obviously Viridian is probably our biggest client, customer in the city of Madison. So certainly they're our biggest home builder. So anyway, that was probably the biggest thing that happened, Jim, but really because of the floods, everybody was really kind of behind this at the time. I think if I had to do this again, I would get a lot more pushback. Virtually, we're 4 years out from the flood. We have 20 alders on the city of Madison Common Council. Probably 16 of them are new since 2018. So there's very little institutional memory of what happened in 2018. There's certainly some, but I don't have that big tailwind, right? So if I were gonna come and do this again, this would be a bigger lift for me.
I don't know if we've ever had any pushback from developers in Middleton, have we, that Jim or Ken? Or Eric or Rich for that matter? I can't recall of any.
Well, you probably just haven't seen it then, because I think we get a lot of pushback, Warren.
I'm just Eric, staff probably get
You guys
staff
get it.
more. Yeah.
One in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pushback to make us revise our ordinance or change it?
No, just trying to work around the.
Oh, to meet it. Oh, sure, I can understand
Yes.
that. But I'm talking about when we developed the ordinance, I don't think we got any pushback from developers at that time.
Yeah, that I don't know, but I would believe you're correct.
I wasn't here, but it's not uncommon, and I understand it, that they'll call the elected officials and say, hey, this is going to cost you money and it's going to cost me money and I'm not going to develop here. I've heard that from other communities. I'm sure it happens here too.
Yeah, and I should just be clear, I don't mean to characterize Viridian's comments as pushback. Yeah, I really, in true honesty for me, I would not characterize it that way. They did not object to the additional volume required and the additional land required. It wasn't an objection to meeting the code. What it really was for them was uncertainty for the future of their development, right? So they didn't mind meeting the standard. What they didn't like was not knowing what standard they would have to meet if
Mhm.
they replatted. So, you know, and I'm sure, you know, you've heard this from developers, you know, many times, as I have, right? Largely, they are indifferent to regs, although I'm sure they would like fewer if they had that choice. But what they really want is certainty, and they want everybody to play by the same rules, which is why they've pushed so hard at the state level, right? Because they want all communities to be the same, so they can go to whatever community they want and they follow the same rules. That's what most developers, what I hear from them, is what they want. So.
But Eric, I mean, right now, that's what, I mean, the way it works in Middleton is if a subdivision proposal comes in, they are to meet the requirements of the ordinance at the time that is approved, right?
Yeah,
I mean, and if it takes them, now there's no time ticking on that, is there? Or if they take 5 years or 10 years, they still got to meet what was approved back in 2022, whenever we approved it?
yeah, it would all be grandfathered, I imagine.
Okay.
And Greg, I know there's provisions in what you guys changed that talk about you're not going to grandfather. I assume that's for redevelopment of a chunk of an old plat, basically.
No, it's a slightly different take on that. So what we used to do up until this revised ordinance, as long as I've been here, which is getting on to be a long time. And so if you came in, so the best example I can have is the Old Sauk Trails Park, right? That was developed in like 88, something like that is when that started to be developed. Our first ordinance went into effect in 1983. And so, you know, it's fun to go back and look in those files and look at the dot matrix printouts of TR-55 DOS versions and stuff. But it was pretty rudimentary stuff that they were doing back then, right? But they created all these 1 acre lots, and more than 1 acre, right? So this was a big business park. So in 83 at the time, our ordinance only required detention when you were developing greater than a 3 acre commercial parcel or a 5 acre residential parcel. Okay. So they came in, they did the big Old Sauk Trails Park, right? And they left all these, you know, lots somewhere between 1 acre and 5 acres in size to be developed. And they still have some vacant lots out there today. Well, right as clock moves forward, right now we are down to requiring detention when you're over a half an acre, basically, right, of new development. And so up until the ordinance revision, what we would say is, well, you know, the plat was recorded and it had an approved stormwater management plan at the time it was recorded. So even though your lot is being developed, what we would say is detention was satisfied at the plat level, but all the other new stuff was not. So because there was a detention requirement in place at the time of platting, we called that good. We checked it off our list, but infiltration, TSS, thermal control, if it applied, all had to be satisfied. And what we said now is, well, okay, you did have detention at the plat level, but only up to the 10-year event. And now we require the 200-year event. So we're going to require you to provide on site on your development the difference between the 10 and the 200, that volume between the two. So it mostly applies to commercial and industrial sites. Individual residential sites would never reach that. Well, I suppose you could get a residential site that was over 20,000 square feet in the city of Madison, but it's pretty rare that would actually trigger that threshold.
And that volume difference, you're analyzing that just with arithmetic?
Yeah, it's really, and we know it's wrong. You know, so all the professors on this call don't need to tell me. I already know we're doing it wrong. But we calculate what the 10-year detention would have been, right? And so it's 1 acre foot, and then we calculate the 200-year, and we just subtract the two, right? I fully know that we're underestimating that if we routed all this stuff, we would get a different answer. But it gets bureaucratically, it gets really hard and complicated to implement that. So we chose just to do it that simple arithmetic difference.
Rick, one thing that we've had problems with, these concerns I have is some of the structures that we build, are they performing correctly? And I don't think we've monitored a lot of them to make sure that we know a lot of them are, especially infiltration, aren't working.
Oh,
Has
yeah.
Madison got a program of how they look at infiltration basins to see if they're working or not?
Yeah. And you hear the hesitation in my voice, Warren. We do have a program, and it is better than the DNRs, which is to say the DNR only enforces things based on complaint for the most part, right? That's kind of how they do that. We do require everybody to submit an annual report, right? But and we do follow up if you don't submit an annual report. So we're pretty good about this. But here's where we fall down, right? We have, last I checked, close to 500 in things that we have to check in every year. We're looking for like 500 reports. You know, I don't know about Eric, but surprisingly, I don't have staff just waiting to review 500 reports when they come in. So we pretty much trust the professional who's submitting them, right? So it's supposed to be, it's sealed by a professional engineer, right? And if they say it's functioning, I kind of believe them, right? You know, we just file that away. If you tell me it's working, I believe you, unless I get a complaint about it, right? And then we will go out and visit the site and write up orders. So there is some incentive to inflate the functioning of your device, right? About how well it might be performing. That's for all the private ones, you know, like the things on a Walmart site or a Quick Trip site, that type of thing.
Right.
The ones that we accept from a public development, say a Viridian plat, we do better on those, but meaning we typically do not accept them until they are functioning, and those we actually check, right? The vegetation has to be in place. We have somebody who goes out and checks to make sure there's a requirement that they actually submit us a vegetation plan by a professional, that they do a little grid and check what's growing before we accept it. You know, so we've gotten better at that. And I will say probably half of all the infiltration basins we've built in the last 5 years have to be rebuilt before we accept them. Sometimes it takes 5-6 years before we accept these things. They are not an easy thing to establish. So we do have a system, but we don't have a great system. It's sufficient to comply with what the DNR requires for our permits, Eric, but it is not, you know, I'd be lying if I said this is 100% compliance, right? There's a lot of trust built into this system that the engineers submitting the report are doing a level and honest piece of work.
Greg, did you say that in the case of subdivisions and stormwater practices that are serving multiple single-family parcels, let's say, in Madison, you no longer, these are all being dedicated to the city for their ownership and responsibility? They're not staying with a homeowner group or anything like that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct 98% of the time. There are a few exceptions. The UW Research Parks can own theirs, and we have an easement over them. There's one subdivision I can think of in the city of Madison on right by McFarland, Secret Places, that has a true functioning neighborhood association, and they have a couple pumps and fountains in their ponds, and they wanted ownership of those. So we have an easement, and those are held by the neighborhood association. But those are really rare. The 98% of these are owned by the public, taken in dedication.
Yeah. Okay.
Greg, do you know off the top of your head what the annual stormwater fee is for one ERU?
Yeah, the average, my data is probably, I don't have this year's. We redo our rates in April, so it's brand new. So I'm probably off a little bit, but it's about 140 bucks a home for an average single family residence.
Middleton is 45. And
No, I think it's 20, Jim.
well,
I mean, it's 45 with the flood referendum,
yeah.
which
it was-
sunsets next year.
Yeah, it's 15, I think, is the pre-flood number.
Yeah, ours is much higher than that.
Yeah.
Yours is more in line with what it should be. Yeah.
So Greg, this is Gurdeep Brar. So how do you use that money? Is that specifically just for the maintenance of those detention ponds, or how do you use it?
That is all, the stormwater utility is a segregated account within our budget. So everything associated with stormwater is paid out of that. So maintenance, new construction, reconstruction, water quality, dredging if we have to do it, street sweeping, leaf collection.
Staff.
Thank you. Eric.
Staff.
Yep. That's right. Staff is paid. Thank you. Yep. So, basically anything you can think of, any water quality function, any flood conveyance, all the studies we are doing are all paid for out of that. Any big flood control projects that occur, or, retrofits of a basin or anything like that. The only thing that's not paid for by the utility is any development. Anything with a development is paid for 100% by the developer, and not funded by the utility. The utility has no business funding development.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just add, because I am advocating here, and most cities have stormwater fees and budgets and coverage similar to what Madison's doing as far as the scope of their program. That Middleton is definitely an outlier in that regard.
Yeah, the reason is they had a hard time getting it approved.
Well, everybody does. It's not, nobody
I
wants
know.
a fee. Nobody
I
wants
know.
a fee, but
I'm in favor of a broader one without a doubt. I think we all were,
yep.
but
it
we don't
was-
have some council members here that could disagree with.
I think we have our head in the sand most of the time on that issue. So I'll just say that. You can put that on the record if you want, Eric.
It's recorded, Jim.
You can fire me if you want. That's okay. Anyway, Greg, do you know how much? I think the county has adopted a lot of the stuff that the city has done now. Do you know much about what the county's ordinance requirements are?
I haven't read them. I know they adopted the 200 year from talking to Jeremy, but I do not know if they adopted the redevelopment standards. I don't know if they did that or not.
Eric,
I don't think they did. I think partially. And I think they used your green infrastructure language, first half inch through green.
Which, by the way, credit where credit is due. That stuff is totally stolen from Milwaukee Met, right? I did my first shot at this was horribly engineered. I had lots of numbers and complicated formulas about how we were going to do this. And then I read what Milwaukee Met was doing and I went, wow, this is a lot easier. And I did that, or at least a version of that. So I'm not taking credit here for this. This is really cribbed from them. Their system's much simpler than the one I had in mind.
I'm thinking for the county that the redevelopment issue probably isn't as much of a factor, though. They don't, I can't think of what kind of examples they would have. At least as
Well, they over
frequently as-
promulgate in everywhere though, right? So, it's interesting. I've mentioned just a couple of things in here that I want to do over. We gotta fix some things. When we drafted this, I did not, in my head, I did not anticipate that people were going to be redeveloping stuff that had already had a stormwater requirement, right? In my head, when I wrote this, I was envisioning the East Washington corridor. That's what this was largely written for, right? And since then, we have had at least half a dozen people come in and redevelop stuff that had already had a stormwater requirement. And the ordinance is really silent with regard to what you do with regard to that. But we've created an internal policy, much like the DNR, to not allow backsliding. So if you are redeveloping, you got to keep everything you had, plus you got to do what the new ordinance requires. So if you had an acre foot of storage on your site, you get to keep an acre foot of storage, plus you get to do all the stuff that we're requiring as a redevelopment. But if, again, given a do-over, I would actually write that down instead of just creating an internal policy after it became clear that we didn't think about this. And the we is, mostly me. I'm taking I'm taking the blame for this. So there's also no exemptions written in, right? And that's a mistake as well. I'm not saying that you should get a full exemption, but and the hardship case was us. The Madison Market right down the corner of First Street and East Johnson has really high groundwater, has contaminated groundwater. And as I've said, this was really written to drive people to green roofs, and we were pretty transparent about that during all the presentations. But in that case, they're reusing a 1950s building. So the roof can't carry any additional load, right? So they couldn't do a green. They couldn't even do the little, sedum boxes on the roof. The roof had virtually, when it was built, it met code, but code continues to evolve, right? So a roof that met code in 1950 with a factor of safety of 2 meets code by like the skin of its teeth right now, right? And especially when you go from a commercial to a use that's going to have industrial use to a use that's going to have commercial people in it, right? The codes, I don't understand the roof codes, but what I can tell you is our facilities people said, Greg, I can't do a green roof, and if you're going to make me do a green roof, I have to tear down this building, and I don't have enough money to tear down this building, right? So we found a way to do it through water reuse and stuff. But it pointed out things in the ordinance that, again, I hadn't really thought about.
So you would have, now you would go back and incorporate some kind of exemption clause for certain specific conditions?
Yeah, I think, I would. I might. I hesitate to go down this road because it's a big lift. We don't have a variance program in place like you guys do in Middleton anymore. Our board just doesn't allow that anymore. Technically, it's still on the books, but no one has even applied for it in probably 6 years because the board just rejects them. They just say no. The Board of Public Works is the body for Madison that would approve a variance, much like you guys do. And our board just rejects them and says you've got to meet it on site. We're not going to let you out, basically. They haven't approved one in at least 6 years. So I don't know how, I'm not against the variance program, but we would need a more robust one, I think, like you guys have. Ours, even when ours was being used, it was pretty rudimentary. So,
but just to be clear, Greg, in examples where you've got riparian lands being redeveloped or developed on a lake, those conditions, you don't need to meet there are some language that says you don't need to meet peak flow or volume in those situations, right?
Actually, there aren't. Now we have, you know, much like you guys did, I heard part of that discussion. I logged on a little bit early. There was some lot that was right near the lake that you guys were discussing. And we have, you know, we have done kind of the same thing. We have said, well, okay, it doesn't make a lot of sense to detain 50 feet from Starkweather Creek, right? You're literally on the creek. But I'm not going to let you out. So what we've done is sometimes we've made administrative trades to require, they have to meet all the water quality requirements, all the treatment requirements, but we've let them out of infiltration or something, so
Yeah.
we have done that on an administrative basis, but we don't have a formal process for that like you guys do here.
Okay.
Greg, couple of things. One is that you said that you have only 500 ponds which give a annual report. So that means those are the private ones, and most of your detention ponds are public. Is that what it is?
We have about 500 privates, in the city that have to report to us every year. And then we have public features. I think we're up to close to 300 now at this point. So the private ones do a report. We have to manage our own, just like you guys do. I think Eric, in our new permit, we have to document the depths of our public ponds every 5 years. Once every 5 years, I think, is what's in our new permit. So we have a program to do that. We have an ROV with a sonar, a GPS enabled sonar that goes back and forth and takes depths across all of our ponds. And we shoot to get about a quarter of our inventory every year. So we stay a little bit ahead of our regulatory requirement. And then getting the data is actually the easy part. It's then doing something with it that's kind of hard. But luckily we have a new magician who has written this all into some magic GIS program that actually downloads it and dumps it and compares it to the last known data for the site. It's really pretty impressive. The stuff that you can automate these days with that, as long as you get it in the same format every time. So we do have a program for that, for checking our ponds.
So about the private ones, you said you mostly file them. So do you check a few at random, maybe, 15, 20 of them out of 500 just to, verify or not?
No, we don't. We only check based on complaint or based on if they self-report that they are not in compliance, then we do a site visit to write orders to order them to repair.
Okay, thank you.
So you've done some of those, Eric, make them repair them?
Just ridges of Pheasant Branch Ridge, I think it's called.
I meant Greg, but essentially in our case, Eric, I can't remember any private ones that we've asked to redo, except maybe Costco.
Well, we're kind of in the position Greg's describing also. We're on a 2-year cycle, and we've only taken one enforcement so far, which was not a typical site or a typical problem. That was a problem between bankrupt developer and homeowners association, and that should get rectified this summer, but the city's spending some money to fix that too.
In our case, Eric, the original ones that were developed aren't required to submit an annual or every 2-year report, right? It's only in the last 5 or 10 years that we require.
No, it's probably since mid 2000s that we've been requiring these maintenance agreements get recorded. So we've got 150 of them, maybe.
Right. but most of them don't have any requirement of submitting a annual report.
I bet it's not most anymore, Warren. I mean, we certainly run across them, but there's a lot that are, you know, have a recorded agreement. But we do need, you know, to allocate the time to beef up our enforcement.
Yeah. Like we say, and we know other ones that failed in the city and we haven't been able to do much about it, so. Is there any other questions for Greg or? Oh, I have one question, Greg, is when that 200-year flood with the use in the Atlas 14, did you really mean to raise the frequency to 200 years, or are you trying to compensate for the Atlas 14 not being accurate?
Yes. Yeah, we used Professor Wright was really helpful. Dan was great to work with, and now that, you know, we were pretty transparent about this too during all of our discussion, right? We basically said, if you plot some of Dan's data and you compare the 200-year on Atlas 14 to what Dan thinks the 100-year for this area really, I'll call it really is, given the snapshot in time that he's looking at, they're really close, right? So we, at the time, Wiki had not created the website that Dan has online now. So we were, I didn't want to, when we were doing this, I didn't want to argue about Dan's data, right? I mean, if you've seen Dan's presentation, you know, it's really compelling stuff and it's very interesting, at least to people like us. And I grant you that's a pretty small select set of the population, right? And I didn't want to have to argue about what Dan was doing, right? So it was pretty easy to explain to everybody, well, we're just going to go to the 200 on the accepted, you know, intensity, duration, frequency stuff from the federal government. But we did say when Wiki finished their work and got something online that was, you know, supported, we would probably come back and use that data. So if I do open up the ordinance again to fix all this other stuff, I will probably pitch that. And we would just go to whatever, we would probably just reference Dan's website that he put together through Wiki and whatever so it is a live document. We would probably not put numbers in our ordinance anymore. We would probably say the 100-year as represented on this website, and you would have to go and pull that so that data becomes live, I guess, as opposed to actually listing numbers in our ordinance.
You know, when we did a model study with EOR, we used Wright's adjusted flow, and was able to reproduce the 100-year flood at the gauging station at Pheasant Branch within a few CFS. So whether it was just luck or whether it really worked, it seemed to justify what the adjustment by Wright, what Dan Wright made in reproducing the 100-year flood. So you could keep it that way. I mean, eventually they're going to rechange Atlas 14, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, from talking to Dan, nobody is really, at least I don't follow this stuff at the federal level, but he does, I guess. And he's, when I've talked to him, he's referenced some particular piece of federal legislation, but it doesn't really mandate a time that NOAA has to go through and redo this. And so I don't think now that Dan's work is available to everybody online, I think I would just use his data at this point. I don't think, especially since it's got, you know, what I would call the Wiki seal of approval on this, at least in Madison, I really don't think anybody is going to argue with that. Madison has a climate change and resiliency plan that they've adopted through the Common Council and in the last year or so. And I think that using, you know, Dan's research would be consistent with that. It would surprise me if, you know, and given that the numbers, the difference from what we're using now to Dan's numbers are trivial, right? So I think we would probably do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of communities are going the 200 to 500 year flood.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. If I go to Dan's numbers, do I stay at the 200? Because then
Yeah.
that's another increase, and I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. Me as an engineer, I probably would. I've had interesting discussions with Chin over the years about this issue. He thinks about this in a very different way than I do. But from my perspective, I think I would, if I had it all to my choice, which of course you all know I don't, I would probably go to Dan's data and the 200-year for detention using Dan's data, which is, I don't know where that falls on the NOAA Atlas 14. I would imagine probably getting pretty close to the 500-year would be my guess if I plotted that data.
Yeah, that would make sense to me. Are there any more questions for Greg?
It is time.
If not, thanks a lot, Greg. I sure appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Absolutely. It's nice talking to all you guys. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Greg.
That wraps up our formal presentations, and the only other agenda item is talk about any possible items for our next meeting. Eric, do you want to put on the agenda, or is you got too much to do, or should we look at that FEMA thing or not?
Well, I need to get a meeting with you three and DNR to talk about process. And I think Steve Gaffield was going to be there also.
Did you follow up on that letter I sent you that what we talked about 2 years ago about having them prepare a scoping report for us?
I did read that, and that was not to move the maps through the process. It was to get grants to look at flood reduction possibilities, I think. Does that sound right?
I guess I skimmed over it too quickly. I thought it was to do a FEMA mapping. Well,
either way, we'd have to get them to write a new scope for us after 2 years.
yeah, no, sure. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's up to you when for agenda items, and if that's something on the burner for future discussion.
I'll try to get this rolling in the coming month so we can talk about it in May.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, USGS has finally got the sediment data at Parmenter, so I should be able to do a summary of our 2021 report, water monitoring program.
I'm wondering what our next step is with the ordinance then. I mean, I'd like to keep this moving along and not have it lag too much.
Well, Eric's already made a lot of comments, right, Eric? And the next step is to pass it out to us with your comments or suggestions.
I think that's where we're at. You guys need a detailed revision to.
Are you
Put
think
your
we're
red
at a point where you could do a red line of our current ordinance or not? Is that not
It's,
feasible?
I mean, it's on the list to do. I'm not going to promise you I can get it done by the May meeting.
I understand that's a big job. That's going to be, but that's kind of seems like to me that's the next step where we could actually, start talking language then, right?
I agree.
But I realize it's substantial.
One question I have during our discussion here, we talked about the developer meeting our ordinance as it's written now. In our ordinances would you look at that as minimal standards that they have to meet? Because certainly the city has in mind, like say River Pond, if we want them to take into a more account the increase in volumes of flows that is not written in our ordinance, the city always has a way of not approving their plat, right? Because they don't meet the requirements, not the written requirements, but the desire of the water resource or the opinion of the Water Resource Management Commission that this development may produce water problems in the future in spite of our ordinance.
There is a paragraph that gives, I think in this case, Water Resources Commission the power to weigh in on that, but I don't think that means council would accept your recommendations.
No, but they could take them into consideration. Oh yeah, fine, you met our ordinance, but there are concerns that we have, and so we aren't going to approve your plat the way it is.
But you're saying our council has final say on that. We can make our recommendation on, upping the management levels, but we don't have the authority to stop it. I don't believe. If it's
No, I don't think we have the authority to stop it, but the council certainly does.
yes.
Even though you've met our our ordinance requirements, we think there are some problems that you're be produced by this development that we want addressed.
Right.
Yeah, I think at some point, if we can justify a concern, then I suppose that's all there is to it. We can make that recommendation.
Yeah. Well, certainly Graver Pond is right in front of us, and acre development is right behind it. So.
Right. I mean, I'm gonna. Sorry, this is going on so long, but I'm all in favor of upping the requirements in lots of different ways. Flow and infiltration and all those factors that we are looking at. But I always get a little annoyed when I hear comments about, we're going to make this development so there's no offsite impacts, comments like that, or we're going to make sure there's no offsite impacts. Well, that's just not true, right? I mean, no matter how many requirements we put on a site, you take an undeveloped site and put a square foot of permeable cover on it, you're going to have offsite impact. It might be, I'm being a little bit exaggerating here, minimal, but nonetheless, you cannot have a development that has no offsite impacts when it comes to stormwater, no matter how many requirements we put on it.
Well, we're not saying that, are we, Jim?
No, I don't know. I hear that from developers sometimes, and I've heard it from some elected officials sometimes. And so I just want to be, I just like to be careful about that. That's all. That we're not fooling anybody. That there will be offsite impacts when the acre property is done and when the Bella Farm is done. We can't. I don't want to give the impression that there's no impacts. That's all.
Yeah. Okay.
I just want to say one thing, that I'm still trying to find good candidates to replace Caroline. If you know some folks, please ask them to apply. I need some really good candidates. And I don't think I have them. Would be appreciated. Anybody tell them to, hey, send the application right away.
I've mentioned some names to you in the past, haven't I, Eric? I don't know if you've passed those on or not.
We talked about Roxanne, right?
Now I'm talking about the guy that's, I always forget his name. It's listening to a lot. The engineer listens to a lot of our.
Rick Eilertson.
Yeah.
Not a resident.
Oh,
He's not a resident.
neither am I.
Neither is Caroline.
I think
more.
Ken has special powers. There's
You got that pot
Longevity,
clause,
not sure how
right?
that works.
Yeah.
We're getting a little afield of
Yeah.
the agenda.
Yeah, okay, I'll
Okay.
rule
Anyway.
the meeting closed.
Any help would be appreciated, and thank you. Great job.